You are all very lucky. You get 2 objectives for the price of 1, and we're very pleased to be able to bring them to you. But since we have so much to cover, we're going to get right to business. Here's the menu, a 4-course menu with 4 presenters and 4 aspects of our overall topic. I am Jeff Mallinson, the Dean of the School of Theology. I will be talking about a Christian perspective on human nature, especially as we see it in Holy Scripture and its relationship to politics. Second will be Dennis Jacobson. He is an affiliate faculty member with us, a fine attorney. He has just come back from a sentencing this morning. And he also, this is a good bit of trivia, was a Sunday school teacher for our Jim McCormick. Third will be Bill Mesa. He is an associate professor in the School of Business, and he will suggest how this will be related to an organization such as CCU. And finally, Ryan Hartwig, who is the director of Residence Life, will suggest how we might teach this effectively to students. I'll turn your attention to the note cards at the end of your rows. We were hoping that we get a little more participation through anonymity, and then we can make sure no one has a 15-minute speech question. And if you will, at the end of Dennis Jacobson's presentation, Ryan will go around and collect those. We'll also collect question cards again at the end of the overall presentation. Please do write legibly. There's one disclaimer I would like to give, and that is it's important to distinguish a belief from its defense. This is something that was very important in the history of the church, especially as they used Bible verses to defend statements of faith. If for some reason you would like to, on the card, challenge a biblical interpretation that we use, or in the case of Dennis, if you'd like to challenge some statistic or some research study, that is fine, because this should not be held against the overall thesis that we're bringing before you today. So the defense of it, this is of course not infallible. Looking at us, none of you will have made that mistake, but it's worth saying. All right, well, I would like to start at the beginning. In fact, very literally, I would like to start at the beginning, or perhaps better yet, to give you 2 possible beginnings, 2 Near Eastern accounts of the universe, what we call cosmologies. The first is Babylonian, and the second will be one more familiar to you, that is the account from Genesis. Both of these not only say something about human nature, but they relate to politics. They really do from the very beginning. So for this first account, so that I wouldn't go too long, I made sure I pre-recorded it, and please sit back and listen to the Babylonian creation account. Part of it, I was using some of my own work for summary, and the second half, you won't tell the difference, but it'll flow into some work that our own Dr. Ames has done himself with the primary sources. Here you go. Enjoy.
Before the time of the gods and the world, there was nothing but a waste of chaotic waters, ruled by Apsu and the dragon Tiamat. As time passed, gods were created in hopes of bringing order to this chaos. One of the gods, Ea, killed Apsu, thus making Tiamat and her brood of monsters mad at the gods. Tiamat waged war against Ea and the other gods, and was successful in stifling their efforts until Marduk was born. Marduk, the strongest and the wisest of the gods, was chosen to deal with Tiamat once and for all. Upon summoning the powers of all the other gods, Marduk went to war with Tiamat. Tiamat was no match for Marduk and all his power. Marduk caught her in his net, and when she opened her mouth to breathe fire at him, he let loose the 4 winds, which filled her up, rendering her defenseless. Marduk then speared her with a lightning bolt, split her in 2, and raised half of her body to create the sky, and with the other half he created the earth. Victorious, Marduk donned royal garments and was recognized to be king by the other gods. In response to his divine adoration, Marduk commissioned the creation of humankind to bear the burden of work so the gods might rest. Ea obeyed and created humankind from the blood of Kingu, one of the complaining captives who provoked the cosmic battle. In gratitude, the gods asked Marduk how they might honor him, and he asked that they build him Babylon as a shrine. They built a ziggurat, and Marduk was enthroned by the divine assembly.
That may be exotic to you, but something more familiar, perhaps, is the account of creation in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. You know most of the rest, I assume. And many scholars have pointed to similarities between the Genesis account and other Near Eastern parallel accounts, but I think it's very clear that the distinctives or the differences are very important for our conversation, especially when we get to Genesis 1:31, which says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. So how do we compare the two? In the Babylonian account, we have a primal chaos. We have a world that is created, or at least as far as we're concerned, the world that we know is created through violence, through power, through the defeat of all that is chaotic. What this means at the end is that the state, for the Babylonians, is the tool of God's creation. And therefore, the king is God's representative, and the state is salvation. If you're interested, there are several conversations about this. The theologian Walter Wink describes this primal chaos and basic violence in the universe and how this fits into politics. But it's important for us to consider how this is very different from the Genesis account. Because in the Genesis account, we don't have salvation in the state or salvation through violence. Rather, we have salvation in relationship to God. God does not create the world and then create human beings to serve as his slaves. Rather, God creates the world and puts into this harmonious world human beings that have a nature that is in the image of God. Genesis 1:26, the imago Dei. We are created in God's image, and we are created to have fellowship with God, not as slaves. So dehumanizing statism, as we might see in Babylon or more recently with the Nazi and Stalinist regimes, is truly unbiblical and is, if anything, Babylonian. So let me assert this thesis at the outset, and I hope it will help you to kind of guide what we think about as we go through the various presentations. Humans are created in the image of God, and because of this, they must not have their dignity or freedom trampled by power. But since humans are fallen, we need some restraint through government. But because government itself is comprised of humans, it must be restrained. Now, that was bulky, so I will turn to a much clearer statement from James Madison, who says, of course, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But if angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But we don't see too many halos, so we have to continue to turn to Scripture to figure all this out. And though the Genesis account, familiar to you, will be important for this conversation about human nature, as Christians, thinking theologically, we don't stop there. And in fact, the most clarity that we can find perhaps is in St. Paul, especially his Romans. Romans 3:11 draws from the Psalms and says, there is no one righteous, no, not one. No, not even your favorite candidate for president. None of us are completely free from sin. In fact, we've turned away. But what's more interesting to me is Romans 1:18. Nope, I've got to go back before that happens. Romans 1:18, where Paul describes human understanding as fallen. That is, we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, what this leads to is a sense in which we can all say that we believe in total depravity. Depends on how we define it. And you're looking, saying, well, the first of the 5 points of Calvinism, not me. Okay, but I think that in a certain sense, all Orthodox Christians are at least 1 point Calvinists. We believe in total depravity. But it's a matter of how we define total depravity. Total depravity, in its very basic sense, does not mean that we are absolute evil. It does not mean that we're as bad as we can be. It does not mean that we're demons. But it does mean that every aspect of our humanity has been infected with sin. It means that our minds cannot see the world in its full truth because of sin. Our wills do not run to the truth and to righteousness because of sin. And even our emotions can lead us into the wrong direction. This, of course, plays into politics as well as anywhere else. Now, I wanted to show you how this worked with the help of Krista Koval and the scientists. Although we only got one scientist, here is a video. Please sit back and enjoy. We're going to demonstrate the nature of human beings and sin with an experiment. Remember, sin is blue.
Okay, we're here with Dr. Krista Koval, and she's going to help us with a scientific experiment to illustrate a theological concept. So first, we were going to look here at a beaker of water. Now, I'm assuming that this is water. Am I right in assuming this?
As far as I can tell, this is dihydrogen oxide, otherwise known as water. But I can test the pH of it to make sure there aren't any other chemicals in there. Looks like it's clean and pure water to me.
Our chemist is officially now verifying that this is indeed water. Now, she's going to add dye, a blue dye, and we're going to see what happens. This is exciting, folks. We've now added twice a little bit of dye. Now let's stir this up. I'm not sure this is
That dark enough?
dark enough. We'll see if they can see it. Mr. Wizard would be proud. Okay, you can now see that it is a light shade of blue. Blue. Now, what would you call this substance?
Blue dihydrogen oxide.
But you would still say it is indeed water.
Correct. Water
Different
with
color.
blue dye in it.
Let's test the pH and make sure indeed it is still
All right.
it is still water.
Yes, looks like water to me.
It is water. We've proven our point.
Well, what's the point that we've tried to prove? You ask. Well, if sin is blue and you are water in this illustration, every aspect of you, every nook and cranny, every part of you that is hidden and every part of you that is seen is affected by sin. But we would not call you, essentially, evil. In fact, there was a Reformation theologian named Matthias Flacius Illyricus. His parents were mean. And so from this, and from his assumption or his interpretation of Protestant theology, he made this statement that people are evil by nature. He made the statement that we are essentially evil, we are essentially wicked. And even though it sounded like good Protestant theology, all of his peers condemned that statement. They said, no, we are not evil by nature. This would make God the author of sin. We are good by nature, but our ancestors have corrupted this nature. Our ancestors have rebelled. We are now completely affected by sin. We are thoroughly sinful, that is, thoroughly in every part of us, but we are not essentially sinful. That's the nature of this illustration. But it's not just Protestants that have held this. In fact, as I said, I believe all Orthodox Christians have emphasized this point about human nature. In fact, the Roman Catholic fantasy writer J.R.R. Tolkien actually very intentionally addresses human nature when he describes orc nature. The orcs, if you don't know, are goblins in the Lord of the Rings mythology. And at one point, one of the hobbits is talking to the other. The hobbit Sam asks the hobbit Frodo whether orcs live on foul air and poison. And Frodo says, no, they eat and drink, Sam. The shadow that bred them can only mock. It cannot make, not new, real things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. And if they are to live at all, they have to live like other creatures. Foul waters and foul meats they'll take, if they can get no better, but not poison. Why? Because even orcs are not essentially evil. For St. Augustine, there is no such thing as pure evil. There is only a parasite on the good. So if you want to read more about this, I would encourage you to look to St. Augustine's Confessions. Or, more easily accessible to you, perhaps, will be Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, where he spends a good deal of time talking about evil as a perversion of something good. Not just a deprivation, but also a perversion. Anyway, because of human fallenness, the Bible itself contains warnings against absolute power, unrestrained government. The Old Testament example that is best suited for this conversation is 1 Samuel 8. In 1 Samuel 8, the people, as you know, are crying out for a king. They want a king like the Babylonians, whose cosmology, by the way, is very different from the Judeo-Christian cosmology, as we've already seen. But they're crying out for a king, and they don't realize what that entails. So Samuel says, listen here, if you have your king, you've got to be aware that they're going to take your sons and daughters, they're going to turn them into charioteers, they're going to turn them into perfumers and IRS workers and all that. And then there will come a day when you get tired of all the taxation and you will clamor and you will say, God, please take away this oppressive government. But God will not listen because you did not listen to Samuel. That's Samuel. We also see this in the New Testament. Acts 5:29. The apostolic statement is, we must obey God rather than men. To be sure, Scripture positions government as something Christians should normally obey, to live peacefully in the world, and yet they do not absolutize the state. And because of that, we on occasion must be discerning and challenge unrestrained authority. So how does this play out in Christian history? I will only talk briefly about the West because the East takes us into a different trajectory where, because of the longevity of the Byzantine Empire, the East tends to conflate church and state, Christianity and power. But in the West, it develops a bit differently. The early church in the West, because of its persecution at the hands of soldiers, was largely quietistic, that is, it opted out of government, pacifistic, that is, it often refused to be a part of military service because it did not want to bloody its hands with the blood of martyrs. And so its role with respect to the state was ambivalent at best, but it could also be a prophetic voice, the voice of the martyr, the voice of the prophet, against power. But very little cooperation because of the situation at the time. And this existed relatively intact, this perspective, until Constantine, the first ostensibly Christian emperor. And some have argued that Constantine presents a bigger problem, or presented Christians with a bigger problem, than it did to pagans. Because pagans now just had to adopt to a new religion, whereas Christians now had to renegotiate their interaction with power and the state. And it was very difficult for a while, until the two great Latin theologians, Saints Ambrose and Augustine. Both of them were very emphatic about the nature of human beings as fallen. In fact, Augustine is very important for contrasting theology in the Orthodox tradition with Pelagianism, which said that human beings are essentially good. They are born without stain, and they are completely free in terms of free will and all that. Well, both Augustine and Ambrose, emphasizing human sin, also are very clear about the two kingdoms theory. And essentially what they say is, we have the kingdom of human beings. Government is necessary, perhaps even a necessary evil, but there is also the power of the church. And these two are in tandem. It's a political dualism. And so throughout even the Middle Ages in the West, you have at least some kind of balance of powers, some kind of limitation on government. Now this existed all right, the two kingdoms theory, until the Reformation, in which you didn't just have two kingdoms, you had now multiple kingdoms, Lutheran kingdoms, and Catholic kingdoms, and Calvinist kingdoms. And so this became very difficult. There was a crisis of authority, and you might find yourself, as a Protestant, within the borders of a Catholic king, and on occasion, you might find yourself persecuted, in fact, violently persecuted. So some ask the question, can a good citizen oppose a tyrannical authority? Then there were two other trajectories. The Anabaptists, those who weren't going around trying to bring the end of the world with the sword, ended up as pacifists and quietists, and they opted for that kind of persecuted church model of the first 3 centuries. But the magisterial reformers, that is the Lutherans and the Calvinists, the Reformed, that were more in the mainstream, opted for a theology of resistance. And I can't go into the full theory, but here's the gist of it. Because God's justice and God's holy word transcend the state, transcend the king, some situations justify resistance to the state, and even at times tyrannicide, that is killing a king. Because of sin, Rulers can become unruly and evil and worthy of oppression, and worthy of opposition. But because of sin, and here's the key, the average citizen can't do whatever they want. You can't just have Lee Harvey Oswalds running around assassinating everybody they don't like. So how do you deal with this? The sin of the king and the sin of the average person. And the answer for them was the lesser magistrate theory. Revolution was to be carried out by a respectable ruler, a prince or a duke, who had a legitimate right to overthrow or at least oppose a tyrant. This theory also involved natural law. The thinking of the reformers that there was an ethical standard that transcended the will of the king. Might did not make right. And we continue with some of these themes all the way until the last century, when the confessing church, especially Dietrich Bonhoeffer, had to face the paradoxical views that they had. Bonhoeffer himself begins as a pacifist, but ultimately realizes that Hitler, as a tyrant, as a wicked man, needed to be opposed. And how could you oppose him? Through natural law and through the higher law of God's justice as found in Scripture. So even Bonhoeffer, originally a pacifist, involves himself in an attempt on Hitler's life that didn't work out. He ended up getting himself executed. But even there, we saw this very basic concept in Christianity of a check against government. Orthodox Christianity then, this is the upshot, has consistently advocated limits to political power. They have recognized that sinful humanity requires some kind of government, and they have maintained the need for a prophetic voice against the idolatry of statism. And it is my prayer, as we go through this and as you think about this over the next several weeks and on, it is my prayer that we at CCU will continue to foster and speak with a prophetic voice in the face of statism and authoritarianism. Well, over to Dennis. You'd come up and grab this, just like that.